Having now looked at dialect phonology, we can summarize what we've learnt about phonemes and allophones. Phonemes have allophones, and so there might be a set of them. If there are, then that's true under only some conditions. First of all, they must never contrast. If they do, of course, then we have allophones of different phonemes. Pin and tin, P and T, they contrast. They can't be allophones of the same phoneme in that position. Secondly, they have to be in complementary distribution. That is, one of them appears in one environment and the other appears in another environment, and not vice versa. Each has its own little niche where it belongs. And thirdly, they have to be phonetically similar. We saw that H and NG, H and Ng, can't be allophones of the same phoneme because they're not similar enough. Nobody who is a speaker of English would say that when they hear a Ng, it's actually a version of H. What that means in summary is that they're predictable realizations of a phoneme. We have a phoneme in the language, and we can predict that in a particular environment, in a particular situation, in a word, this is the allophone that will turn up. Phonemes themselves, of course, are abstract. They're mental realities rather than physical sounds. We're now in a position to think about phonemic analysis for a whole language. It consists of three parts. There's the phonemic system itself. We have to know what the phonemes are and how they relate to each other. Then we have to look at the phonotactics of the language, namely, which phoneme is allowed next to which other phoneme. What are the sequence constraints for phonemes in a language? And lastly, we have to look at the allophonic rules, the ways in which a phoneme will be realized as different allophones in different contexts. Well, what about the phoneme system? We're going to suppose that the transcription symbols in the book, that they are the phonemes of English. Now, as you know, that isn't entirely true, because we've already seen that some dialects have more phonemes than others, and some have fewer phonemes than others, but nevertheless, that'll do for the meantime. We also know that the relationships among phonemes are often systematic. Of the stops in English, the oral stops in particular, we know that there are bilabial ones, p and b, there are alveolar ones, t and d, and there are velar ones, k and g, and that they differ from each other in voicing as well. P is not voiced and b is voiced. We also know that there are three nasals to go with them, a bilabial nasal, m, and an alveolar nasal, n, and a velar nasal, ng. So the phoneme system as a system consists of the particular phonemes that the language has and the contrasts that maintain, if you like, acoustic separation between them. Phonotactics is something we haven't really looked at in detail, so we have to ask ourselves, what is it? Well, it has to do with sequencing. We have, say, 46 phonemes in English, but we can't just put them in any old order. There are orders which are definitely not allowed. How do we know that? Well, have a look. Here's a word, sprulge. Sprulge. Is that a possible word of English? No, yes it is. It could be. If you wanted to invent a new word, then sprulge would be fine. You could make it into a verb. It's the what happens when you finished your bungee jump and you've just hit the water and you jump back up. That little jump up is called sprulging. I've just made that up. What about stroished? Stroished. That sounds all right. I went to a party last night and I came home feeling absolutely stroished. Doesn't seem so bad. What about thming? That definitely sounds terrible. Now, the reason it's terrible is you can't put a th in front of a m in English at the beginning of a syllable. That just isn't allowed. Now, it's not that we can't pronounce it. We can all sit there happily pronouncing thmering, thmering, but it's not English. What about fneeze, fneeze? No, absolutely not. You cannot put an F next to an N in an English word, at least the phoneme F next to the phoneme N at the beginning of an English word. Again, it's not that it can't be pronounced, it can. Fneeze is quite easy to pronounce, but it isn't an English sequence. Grulch, yeah, that doesn't sound so bad. Grulch. Swank, no, that doesn't sound so bad either. So what we know is that there are phonotactic rules. Rules for a language which say you're not allowed these sequences, but you are allowed other sequences. Let's have a look at consonant clusters in English. If you have a look through your dictionary at the number of words that have consonants at the beginning, more than one consonant, you'll find that there are rules restricting the sequence. First of all, you're only allowed 3 at a time at the beginning. So you're allowed strong, S-T-R, splash, S-P-L, scratch, S-K-R. 3. You're not allowed another one. That's impossible. The first is always S. If you have 3, the first one is S. The second one is a voiceless stop. Splash, street, scream. And the third one is one of the approximants, and not all of those with all of the others. You can work out some of those restrictions yourself and see that S, P, J, spew, that's all right, and S, K, J, skew, S, P, W, yes, well, you'll have to think about that. See if you can find some words for all of those. Lastly, there are allophonic rules, the rules that determine which allophones a phoneme will turn into in particular situations. Allophones, as you will recall, are realizations of phonemes in specific phonetic contexts. So, that means you can write rules that predict which allophone will turn up in which particular context. We can already do that. We know that the T phoneme at the beginning of a syllable has a puff of air after it. So we have a context, beginning of a syllable, we have a phoneme, the phoneme T, and we have the allophone with the puff of air. So we can write allophonic rules. And allophonic rules have an input, that is a phoneme, they have an output, an allophone, and they have a conditioning factor, a phonetic environment that causes this phoneme to be pronounced in the particular way it is. So the input is a phonemic form, say, of a word, and the output is a phonetic representation of that word, and the conditioning factor is an environment, a phonetic environment. So how might that look? Let's suppose that we write them this way. An input, the phonemic form of a word, is converted into, or changes to, or becomes, or better, is realized as a particular output in a particular environment. A particular input is realized as a particular output in a given environment. Here we go. The phoneme T is realized as the allophone. What is that? That upside down J. It's a tap, just the quick flick of the tongue against the alveolar ridge. And after the slash we get vowel gap vowel. That means when the T is between vowels. So T is realized as D in between vowels. How do we know that? Well, we know that rule exists because Americans pronounce butter, butter. Right? That's a T turning into the tap allophone between vowels.